wanted to get your take, Matt, on where you think the Trump White House is right now. It feels like they go from strength to strength as the Democrats flail. They've got some challenges, but overall, where do you think they are?
I think they're staying the course pretty well. I think they've got a long list of items that they've prioritized, and I think that what we're seeing is they're not going to get too knocked off course. Now, obviously, we see them going into battle with judges, they haven't really had a lot of battles yet with Democrats because most of this has been done between the White House and obviously the legal system. But we are going to get into very soon a deeper battle on reconciliation, and a lot of that will be done without Democrats, but Republicans on Republicans trying to sort of navigate these priorities. But
and just for people to remember, reconciliation is all about the big spending bill. Basically, when you hear that, folks, it just means this is the family putting together the budget. Yep. And the Republicans are going to have some disagreements amongst themselves, but they might be able to get it done without Democratic support.
And it does get messy like any family exercise, right? We've seen that with the budget votes just a couple weeks ago. But I think one thing that you and I have talked about previously is the more involvement President Trump has, the more likelihood there is of them being able to get in the car together and make it to the event. And I think that's something that we're going to be watching really closely. But
you'll just have like some Republicans drawing a line in the back seat saying, don't cross this line.
Yes. Mommy's hitting me. Mommy's hitting me. Mom, he doesn't want to do my
Don't make me turn this car around.
My state and local tax deductions, he's poking me, whatever. But it will be colorful. But I think in the end, President Trump, his entire economic team will be super involved in just trying to keep everybody on the same page. But one thing that Stephen Miller said about some of these legal fights that I thought was really interesting, and you guys talked about it this morning on Newsroom with Kayleigh McEnany, was the biggest and most important commodity an administration has is time. And so their goal is to not get knocked off course with all these different legal battles and challenges and things like that, but to keep doing as much as they can, particularly in these first 100 days. What happened just last week with the Department of Education, I think, is a really big part of that. This is something that he ran on. It was an applause line. It was a huge focus and a priority. So they're balancing not getting knocked off course, but at the same time needing to really effectively message these huge things. Because I think you probably saw, same as I did over the weekend, the flurry of misinformation about what something like this means is just insane to watch. In the last 10 years or so, there have been all of these new sort of media influencers who come out with, here's what this means for you. And a lot of it's wrong, which is why you and I put so much energy into this, trying to explain policy. But the amount of just viral disinformation about what closing the Department of Education, what's out there is crazy.
Describe some of the biggest things that were misinformation that, especially, I love the moms who listen to this podcast. So maybe they've heard some of these and we could right the ship.
Absolutely. And it's not even their fault. They're trying to just get their news and figure out what's going on. Right. One of my dear cousins who's just about to graduate and become a teacher said, what does this mean for me? The reality is, for most teachers, it won't really mean anything. I think, when you look at the way that education is funded and overseen, it is done so much more at the state and local level. Now, the federal government does have funds that they distribute to states in Title I grants and a number of different programs. But the problem in the last few years has been those grants and those funds have so many strings attached. Those programs are what President Biden used to push really divisive political agendas and conditions on schools to be able to receive these. Kim Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, wrote a really, really smart op-ed describing they became one of the first states to issue a request for these new block grant programs that will come without the Department of Education that don't have the conditions, because her argument is, let us in Iowa determine how best to use this money to help our students, because these one-size-fits-all dictates from Washington that often are really, really political are hindering our ability to actually get something out of these. And so I think this idea that schools aren't going to have money anymore is insane, but it's also being pushed by the very same people who got us into this mess. I think the most important thing to understand about this entire Department of Education fight, 24% of people right now approve of the state of public education. This is another, when you look at it that way, 75-25 issue, people want education to be fixed.
Right. And when Matt says a 75-25 issue, he's saying that 75% of Americans agree that something needs to be done about education. And I also believe that the administration is drinking from a fire hose.
Yes.
I'll say one of their challenges is, I read a lot this weekend, and maybe they think it's not worth it, But there were so many articles I read, including about the closing of the Department of Education, where administration officials did not return call for comment. And I know that they've got a lot on their plate, but there were a couple of places where I thought this could really use a little bit more of an explanation. And President Trump tried to do that in the Oval Office on Friday. But when you're talking about eliminating the Department of Education, and you have the teachers union who is hyper-focused, and this is the only thing they talk about. Do you know what Randi Weingarten said? She's the head of the teachers union. Her main response was, see you in court.
Yep.
It wasn't, we're worried about the children too. It was, let's fight because they want to preserve the money that they've been getting.
And if I was a Democrat and I really thought this issue mattered, I would find some way to send Randi Weingarten on a vacation somewhere where she could not talk about this issue, because nobody has done more to make a case for eliminating the Department of Education than Randi Weingarten. And they are so reliant on the Department of Education to get money sent to teachers unions, but also they worked directly with the Biden administration, both the Department of Education, but also the Health Department, and also with the CDC, to keep schools closed, even after historic amounts of funding was given to schools in order to keep them open. So if I'm a mom
Also, when has
listening,
the teachers union protested about the test scores?
When have the teachers unions ever shown that they care as much about performance as they do about the funding streams that keep them employed? That's the greatest frustration for me in watching this. If you're a mom who's upset about the state of public education, but you're concerned about the Department of Education closing, look at what the teachers unions have done. Now, what President Trump laid out in the Oval Office that I thought was so important is the very narrow functions that the Department of Education does that are valuable. Caring for students with disabilities, Pell Grants, things like that will be done through other departments. And Linda McMahon was on TV on Sunday talking about this. She said, we will continue to care for students with disabilities through HHS, which is where that was before we had the Department of Education. But I think it's so important for people to recognize the Department of Education is nothing more than a sort of bureaucratic buffet that picks at money that is intended to go to educate students. And it has not for a very long time had any impact on actual student success. It just has been a clearinghouse of funds that have taken funds away from students that could have actually improved performance and given it to bureaucrats and teachers unions and everybody else along the way. So I hope, to your point, that the administration continues to make this case. I thought having Linda McMahon on CNN yesterday to go right in was really valuable. Linda McMahon did a good job of explaining that we are not actually losing any core functions. If anything, states might have more money once you take the, again, bureaucratic buffet of the Department of Education out of the equation so that money can just go to helping students and these core functions are preserved.
The other thing is that President Trump continues to get really high marks on immigration. And the Biden administration looks terrible in retrospect on that. But the other thing that really consumed the weekend is this left hatred of Elon Musk and it turning into violence at Tesla dealerships, and even for people who own a Tesla who might not even like President Trump anyway. But just because they have a Tesla, they're being targeted.
It's crazy. You and I talked about this a couple weeks ago. Could you imagine 10 years ago if someone would have told you President Donald Trump is buying electric cars on the White House lawn while Democrat activists are firebombing an electric vehicle company? Or you have
it would be
Tim
like
Walz.
a conservative group going and trying to destroy a paper straw company. Like, nobody does that.
No, it doesn't make any sense, but that's how rotted brains have become in this sort of hatred of President Trump and the knee-jerk sort of reaction to that. If you watch, like Tim Walz, the video that went viral of him saying, look at these stock prices.
Former vice presidential choice of Kamala Harris. He's the governor of Minnesota. He's trying to make a comeback of sorts.
Which nobody asked for. Nobody said we need more Tim Walz, especially right after voters rejected him so soundly. But he stood on a stage and held up his phone with the stock app to show Tesla stock falling. He had to be reminded that his own state pension funds are invested in Tesla, so he's actually cheering on the demise of his own state's retirees' pension funds. But again, Democrats are cheering about the sort of challenges facing an electric vehicle tax company after President Biden spent the last 4 years putting all of his energy into getting money for electric vehicles. So it just doesn't make any sense, but it goes back to the knee-jerk reaction to oppose anything that President Trump touches. Elon Musk, the same day he was bringing Americans who were stranded in space home,
I know.
Tim Waltz was attacking him and his company on the stage, and in a lot of ways facilitating some of these firebombing, domestic terror attacks on Tesla dealerships and people who own Teslas. It's really crazy to see.
Do you know, based on, I know you follow this a lot, if you follow the money, is this an organized effort? And who is behind the organizing against the Tesla dealerships?
We're seeing the same threads of Arabella Advisors, George Soros, even, groups like Move On are involved in these protests. They're also involved in the same sort of fake demonstration as at town halls. Move On, again, funded by George Soros, the Arabella Advisors Network, and teachers unions. So it's crazy to see this sort of movement of, the bottom line is the left is angry and they don't know how to channel it. And so they're channeling it to bizarre things like domestic terrorism, but it goes back to these same groups that have spent so much money. You hear Democrats talk about, Republicans are just worried about oligarchs. Oh my gosh, our oligarchs have nothing on their oligarchs. And that's the frustration that Dems have with Elon. Elon is doing a fraction of what Arabella Advisors and George Soros do on a regular basis. For example, Elon spent a little over $300 million in the 2024 election cycle. Arabella Advisors spent $1.5 billion in 2020 across the board. Again, they're frustrated because they see that people are moving away from them and they don't know who to blame except for the one guy who's doing a fraction of the great work that they've done for decades. So
can we talk a little bit about Republicans overall, and of course led by Trump, and the fundraising edge that they might have right now? Obviously, they're in power, so that makes a lot of sense. What I understand is that the Republicans have an incredible fundraising edge right now. And is there some sort of investigation or funny business on the small dollar donation entity called Act Blue that the Democrats have been very successful at over the last several years?
I am so glad that you asked that. Act Blue has been very interesting to watch. I want to say 19 different state attorneys general have filed to either investigate or written letters of inquiry about Act Blue and their shady practices. The thing that we have seen pop up and more is Act Blue not verifying the identity of donors who are giving to these causes. And so they've been able to find some foreign donors, some straw donors who don't actually exist but are using sort of fake names and identities through the Act Blue program to give to Democrats. This is going on at the same time as left-wing billionaires like Hans-Jörg Wyss from Europe are funding these causes. And so right now there's a huge focus on, are Democrats using foreign money, whether it's, through Act Blue and shady accounts or through Swiss billionaires like Hans-Jörg Wyss to manipulate American politics. And I think that that's going to be something that, really yields a lot of interesting nuggets because there's been mass resignations from Act Blue. There's clearly something in the water there. I think that there's a really big scandal, and that will majorly destabilize Democrats' fundraising abilities because they've turned that into such a big machine. I think now the question is that machine operating legitimately, or is it operating off of a lot of nefarious activity that our financial, our campaign finance laws clearly would outlaw? So that'll be interesting to track.
Absolutely. All right. I keep teasing Faz Shakir. He used to work for Bernie Sanders, and he's been so gracious and willing to come on Newsroom once a week. And I said to him, and I said to you yesterday, I would love to have a different topic for the Democrats to talk about. But I can't because they're in this, they're in the doldrums.
Yep.
And they can't get out of it. And today there was even more bad news for them. David Shore, who is a Democratic political analyst, he has done some analysis that says the Democrats are even in a deeper hole than he thought. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe you could give me your take as to why you think that is.
Well, and Shore's data is particularly damning because he didn't do a normal poll of a few thousand people in a state. He did this over time with millions of people in his sample size to correct for any kind of adjustments.
And all Democrats.
All Democrats across 2024. And so this isn't some sort of flash in the pan, how are they feeling right now? This is long-term trends that are really, really challenging to Democrats. Because my warning for Republicans is always don't bank on this. The pendulum swings, something will reunify justify them. But what Shore's data shows is there are much deeper underlying challenges. And I see two main reasons for this. One, their policy focus for the last 4 years has just been completely out of whack. You and I talk about this all the time. They put President Biden's entire political capital credit card on funding, tax credits for wealthy people, electric vehicles, bailing out student debt for people who had incredibly high income potential. And they did very little for working class voters when they had that moment in power. And when you look at the youngest generations, that seems to be one of the biggest, scariest points for Democrats. Those youngest voters got locked down during COVID because President Biden made a deal with teachers unions to keep schools closed. Now, guess what? Those kids are voting and they're really, really mad about it. But that's my one bucket, the policy bucket. The other main bucket that I think is driving this is just the total lack of leadership. I say this all the time. Every Democrat wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror, and sees the future savior of their party. No one's looking in the mirror and seeing the person who messed things up. So when you see stories like the NBC story over the weekend that the Bidens want back in after all this, when you see Tim Walz, doing his weird dance walk back onto the stage, they have no self-awareness and no sort of consideration for how they got to this point. But then at the same time, you see you see Bernie and AOC out there holding these big events and saying, maybe we're the future. Maybe it's our moment again. We have those Bernie questions like every 4 years. Bernie will always be able to bring together a crowd because his people travel well. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're having any
Let's
new,
back up a little
moment.
bit and tell people about this because Faz, who I just mentioned, said that he's been organizing these rallies that Bernie Sanders has been doing. And I do admire them for getting out of Washington, D.C.
Sure.
They're going to swing states and holding these rallies. And so they were in Detroit, they did Wisconsin, then they were in Arizona and Colorado, even though I don't think Colorado is really a swing state, although it used to be. And are you saying that the crowds that they're getting, which are pretty substantial, are not organic? Are they traveling from other states to those places?
No, I think they're organic. I think Bernie being able to get 20,000 people together in Denver is notable, but at the same time, Bernie will always be able to get a decent crowd because he has a populist backing and a lot of, when you talk about sort of who's willing to show up at a town hall or a political rally, it's usually the people that are most active and engaged. Bernie has had a more active following for such a long time that he can get those people together. The problem is when it comes to actually voting, there's not enough people to actually swing things their way, but it is a good show of force for them. I just think Bernie and AOC seizing this moment is more of a double down on the sort of extreme, policies and ideas that Kamala Harris really suffered under as a candidate. And so I don't know that they're necessarily going to be any kind of shining star. I think, Democrats right now are just looking really hard for a leader and continuing to find people that pop up, whether it's AOC Bernie, whether it's, dancing Tim Walz, whether it's the Bidens coming back out of, bed to do that. When I read that Biden, the Bidens want back in, it reminded me of Grandpa Joe from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like getting out of bed and having to like stretch his legs in his old nightshirt. Like that's what it feels like. But it just speaks to the fact that Dems have no leadership right now and they're grasping at straws. And that is the biggest reason that we're seeing this historically low level of approval. Yes, Republicans disapprove of them. Yes, moderates and independents, but also overwhelming numbers of Democrats look at their own party and are either mad at them for not doing enough or mad at them because they're so far out on an island that they have nothing in common anymore.
So you have Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania versus like the AOCs and Bernies of the world. Fetterman is saying, whoa, guys, let's be a little bit more moderate here. Let's be thoughtful. Let's not go off the deep end. And then you have that part of the party saying, oh, no, away we go. Who wins out of that?
I don't think anybody wins because I think Democrats in the last 4 years in particular have built so much infrastructure around their far left that's funded by a lot of these dark money groups that they will always be the first people to try and shout down a John Fetterman. And I don't think that Fetterman has enough issues that he really is willing to moderate on to actually build a coalition across the middle. One thing that always frustrates me about moderate Democrats is moderate Democrats get to be called moderate if they vote with Republicans on like one or two key issues. There's those votes with Biden
like
scores.
Joe Manchin sometimes would be called that,
Joe Manchin would get called a moderate even though his voting score showed that he was more than 90% voting with Joe Biden. Susan Collins, on the other side of that coin, actually had like a 65% votes with Trump score in 2019 and 2020. That's an actual moderate. But they would always talk about her being too Trumpy, and they'd call these guys who are, Democrats actual moderates. I don't think Fetterman, he has his issues that I think we all appreciate, particularly Israel, where he is moderate on, and he's willing to sort of be the guy to say, my party's, pretty far out there. But at the same time, I don't really want to get too fooled by him, because on so many other issues, he goes back and votes with his party.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last question about the Democrats. In addition to the Biden saying they want back in and then basically being shown the hand, Kamala Harris, I guess she has enough people out there saying she's thinking she wants to run for governor of California. And so Politico reported that there are other potential candidates who are holding their fire, waiting to see like if she's going to get in. They probably think that they won't. I predict that she won't get in to the race. Am I wrong? Is it like
I don't
a
think
drug?
you're wrong. I think that people look at her being the former nominee and think she's a shoo-in who can walk into it in California. California is very interesting. I'm from California. I grew up, born and raised in California in the Bay Area. I love it so much, but they continue to vote for terrible, crazy people. They had an opportunity to recall Gavin Newsom. It flailed out. But look at what happened with the Prop 36, soft on crime bill, when you had even states like my home county of Santa Clara County came, I want to say 65% for this very smart, sensible soft on crime law. Kamala Harris has so many really terrible policies that killed her at the presidential level that I think would still be a challenge even for the governor of California. And so I think it'll be interesting to see, who pops up there, but I don't think it's a shoo-in at all. And I think that if she sees data that looks bad for her, to your point, I don't know that she makes that jump. I don't know what, Auntie Mamala wants to do in her next few years, but I think that, that campaign was tough on her, and it really, really did define her for a long time to come. I think every candidate who loses takes some time off to try and let people miss them again. I think she will probably take a lot more time than we're seeing from Tim Walz, and we'll see how she comes out of it. But right now, the numbers for her don't look by any means commanding, as sort of a shoo-in to walk into California and take over.
Well, you'll have to tune in again next week, guys, because if we're talking about Democrats, again, as I said, I'm looking for something to compliment. And I do not have it yet. We'll see if next week we'll change that. This is our third segment where I ask what I might be missing. I'm going to ask you first, and then I'm going to tell you something that I've been paying attention to that others might not. I don't think it's the same thing. Go.
I think when we talk about Elon and the bombing of Tesla dealerships, and then we talk about, Democrats attacking an EV company, I go back to what does this tell us about where the climate movement actually is? I teased this a little bit in the first block. Joe Biden spent 4 years putting all of his focus on trying to get more money into the fight against climate change. Now it's been a couple months since he's been in office, and you've got Democrats like Mark Kelly trading in their Teslas because they don't like Elon Musk and buying a Tahoe. Now, I would be appreciative of that if Mark Kelly hadn't spent 4 years working with Democrats trying to outlaw gas-powered cars like a Chevy Tahoe. But I think it's really important to look at this and say, okay, were they serious about the world ending in 12 years? Were they serious about the need to spend trillions of our tax dollars to save the planet from climate change? Or was this all about power? And was this all about sort of diverting money into funding streams that they could control? When you look at things like Stacey Abrams getting $2 billion from taxpayers to oversee a climate grant that she will absolutely make money off of, but she will absolutely have some sort of fungibility there where she can divert money to nonprofit groups that will work to elect Democrats. Is that what their entire sort of climate change focus has been about? It kind of looks like it, especially when you look at how willing they are to turn on probably the most successful electric vehicle company in the country. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is where the resistance on issues like that has gone. When you look at blue states that are trying to sort of continue being the sort of last fighter, on the island in World War II on climate change, what they're diverting to is lawsuits, just to say if we sue enough oil and gas companies, maybe we can take all of their money away and use that for our own climate groups, nonprofits, things like that. The other piece piece is you've got these crazy bills in states like New York, Vermont. There's also been one introduced in California. California wants oil and gas companies to pay for the LA wildfires, to say, oh, climate change did this, even though they know that it was their own mismanagement. They know they didn't do enough to clear brush to, get the kindling out of the way, but yet they have the gall to go out and try and pass a bill to say, we, the legislature of California, can tell oil and gas companies we want this much money back from them to pay for this and whatever political activities we want to fund in the foreseeable future. So that's where the resistance is going, into blue states where they're doing just crazy things between lawsuits and legislation to try and destroy this entire industry. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what a Mark Kelly would have to say about how Arizonans will be impacted if New York essentially bans fossil fuels and everyone else around the country sees higher prices for energy.
Right. I was just hearing about how in New Jersey, there's actually a governor's race in New Jersey this year, and electricity rates are about to go up 45% in June because of the Green New Deal climate ideas. And the Democrats, they might have a run for their money this year. Maybe, I know, who knows. Let me tell you the thing I'm paying attention to, because this will happen next week. And you wouldn't typically talk about a Wisconsin Supreme Court race, but this one is a big one. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court has gone from conservative to liberal, and now there's a possibility of it flipping back to conservative, depending on who wins the statewide special election next Tuesday, April 1st. Yes, it's April Fool's Day. But the last election that they had, it was the most expensive Supreme Court election ever in the state of Wisconsin. This one has already surpassed that. Over the weekend, President Trump decided to get involved. Elon Musk is putting money into it. And the reason this really matters, and the reason, like Elon Musk explained why he cares, is that whoever the next Supreme Court is, whatever the makeup is, conservative or liberal, it is likely, if it's conservative, then they will redraw, or maybe in the liberals, they will redraw the congressional districts and make it harder for more Republicans to win or more liberals to win. So this is a big deal. And I just want to point out one other thing. The last time around, I remember the big topic was abortion. Still an issue in this particular election. But it's kind of become more anti-Trump overall for this time. That race was so expensive, and the liberal won. And I asked Bill Hemmer, what was the turnout? It was insane for a special election on a Tuesday in April for one race. It was something crazy. And in Madison County, where the University of Wisconsin is, it was something like an 86% turnout rate.
Insane.
And you had all these young women on the college campus making sure that every guy who wanted to come to the party knew exactly where their precinct was and how, and made sure that they were going to vote and vote the way that they wanted them to. The liberal ended up winning. I don't know how this one will turn out. I think it's pretty close, right?
It is. It's neck and neck. I saw a poll over the weekend that showed it tied.
So
I think it's going to be really close, and I do think that the dynamics in the state are very interesting. I don't think that Democrats have had the same organizing, but I also think the issue set, to your point before, really is different. When you see Susan Crawford, the liberal nominee, focus all of her energy on Trump and Elon Musk, you can see what she's trying to do there. She argued in the debate that Elon Musk is trying to buy this election, even though she is backed by just about every Democrat major donor we've ever seen. Reid Hoffman has spent like $16 million himself. George Soros is involved there. So I think it's interesting to see that Susan Crawford is not seeing a clear ideological point to hit him on, to hit Schimmel on. I think that she's primarily focused on trying to nationalize this, whereas Brad Schimmel's focused his attacks on her really soft on crime record, on her sort of really being out of the mainstream, far left on a number of issues, particularly letting out violent criminals who have preyed on children. That's been a really key point of a lot of his attack ads. And I think this one will be interesting. We've talked about Ezra Klein and the Democrat sort of shifts. The congressional district and redistricting issue is important because so many blue states are losing massive numbers of people to red states, which means red states are going to get more congressional seats. Ezra Klein has made the argument that a Democrat could win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan and still lose because of that trend happening in other places. Democrats see Wisconsin as sort of their okay corral. If they can keep the Supreme Court seat, they can continue to gerrymander and have more Democrat seats in their state. And that's what Republicans are really trying to fight against here. both, a radical nominee from the left, but also Democrats trying to continue being able to rig the game for the foreseeable future. And so this one has, so much money being poured into it, so much national attention. But at the end of the day, I think Brad Schimmel really is focused on those local issues that people really care about. And I think this is a much different ball game than that last Supreme Court race that you were talking about.
It is. And Wisconsin continues to be the ultimate purple state. All right. I want to ask you one final question. We only maybe have like 35 seconds for you to answer. This is from Jake. If you worked in the White House, how would you communicate with the American public the White House's battle with lower court judges stymieing the Trump agenda with their rulings and temporary restraining orders?
I think you just have to focus on keeping your eye on the ball, staying the course and not getting distracted, but putting out there on the record that you are seeing judges act as super legislators to enforce their will. And I think that that's a huge problem that I have some sympathy for Chief Justice John Roberts as the sort of institutional defender of the courts, because every time these judges go out of their way to try and play the role of legislator in stopping the administration, it makes his job more difficult. And it makes the judiciary look just completely out of control. So I would keep my eye on the ball, forward motion on everything they're trying to do, but continue to keep on the record how outrageous it is that these judges are acting like super legislators. There are over 600 district court judges around the country. The fact that one single person can step in, there is a review process, and that's what Chief Justice Roberts continues to fall back on. But that process piece, people are frustrated by that because they're able to vote for legislators and there's a check on them. They don't feel that same check on these district court judges, and that frustration is real and palpable. And I don't blame the Trump administration at all for voicing that frustration with this sort of weird, aberration in the system.
The other thing is win the argument.
Win the argument.
Right.
Continue to make the case. Because that's the thing. I think when you look at particularly the deportation and Tren de Aragua issue, this judge does look very far out of the mainstream because it sounds like he's telling President Trump, you can't deport not only illegal immigrants, but illegal immigrants who have carried out violent crimes in our cities.
Right.
That is exactly what I would say. I changed my answer. Win the argument.
Just
make
win the
case.
argument, but also win in court. I mean,
yes,
and like if you win in court
too.
and say, see,
Yep,
told you so.
Exactly.
Right.
Good answer.